Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today for the second part of the Parenting the Anxious Adolescent webinar delivered by the Under 18s Wellbeing team. My name is Ellis Blythe. I'm an assistant psychologist with the Psychology in Schools team. And joining me today is Gemma. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Gemma Dutton and I'm a senior children's wellbeing practitioner in the Wellbeing Under 18s team.
Amazing. So like I said, this is part two. Hopefully you all came to part one that was a few weeks ago, or maybe one that was before that and you haven't had a chance to catch up to part two just yet. So thank you for coming along and hopefully you'll find it helpful. So we're going to start off just by checking in with you how your day's going so far. We're going to be using Slido as our interaction tool today. So it's something you can access online. If you just go to slido.com, type it into your web browser on your phone or on your computer, and then there'll be a search bar on Slido that you just put in the number that you see there, which is 205497. And what happens is when we get to questions using Slido, they'll pop up on your phone and you can respond and you can interact with us. This is going to be the main way that we interact with you today, rather than using sort of microphones or using the Zoom chat or anything like that. We're going to stick with Slido. Found it quite helpful in the past. So how would you rate your day so far, with 5 being sort of amazing and 1 being not too great today? So we've got a few responses already, sort of around that middling part of the scale. And hopefully going through today, we'll perk a few people up maybe, and we'll see how we get on. Okay.
I'm going to let you take it from here, Alice, and I'll pop back in a bit.
No worries, thank you. So welcome back. Like I said, it's a part two. So welcome back after joining us for the part one, whenever that may have been. Last week, or last time you were with us, we spoke a little bit about the Brain House and did a bit of a recap from the Psychology in Schools anxiety webinar. We spoke a bit about avoidance and what your young person might be avoiding due to anxiety and how that might perpetuate some of those worried feelings and what we can do to try and challenge that. And in doing that, we looked a little bit about our values as well. We looked at our support networks of both ourselves and our young people and how they can support us and our young person in managing these difficult feelings. And we also looked at reassurance and self-assurance and how we can start to build that a little bit as well. Now, before I move on sort of to the main body of the content, I just want to quickly go through sort of confidentiality and safety with us being sort of on an online platform. So like I said before, we're going to be using Slido to ask you questions and get your feedback. We find it's a really engaging and responsive tool to use with parents. While it is anonymous, your name won't come up. Whatever response you do give will be visible on the screen to all the participants that are here today. So please don't share any personal details or any confidential information, and don't include any information that could identify you or your young person either. We're not able to sort of respond individually to questions that you might put onto Slido. Instead, we sort of draw the overall themes from what you're saying to us and talk to those a bit. And something we find that's quite helpful with Slido is that you can see what other parents are thinking and experiencing as well. So we start to get some of that sort of shared knowledge and shared experience as well. If you have any concerns about a young person's safety that you feel you need support with, sort of in the immediate, then please do contact your GP. As it's a webinar, you'll notice that your microphones and cameras won't work, and that's fine. That's completely normal, because we're going to use Slido as our main way of interacting with you today. Okay, so a quick poll really about what did you try from the last session. So in part one, we gave a few different strategies or different ways of thinking, and we sort of encourage you guys to give them a go over the time between the part one and the part two. So I'm just wondering what you tried. It helps us to know what parents are coming away with and finding helpful. And so we can maybe try to emphasize those bits a bit more, or think about how we explain some of the other bits. So having a few responses so far, which is great. Okay, so we've got a lot about talking about avoidance and swapping reassurance for self-assurance, which is great. And we know these are really common common things that young people engage in when they're feeling anxious. We've got a few people talking about mapping their adolescent support networks, so thinking about sort of those wider systems. And again, a little bit about noticing those thinking traps. Less with the value cards, and that's okay. Maybe that might be something that comes along a bit later to try, because we're aware we've given you a lot of different things so far, and Rome wasn't built in a day. We can't use all of them at once. But it looks like sort of thinking about avoidance and thinking about building that self-assurance have been things that you've really come away and given a go, which is fantastic. What have you found helpful from last session? So what did we cover that you found helpful over the last 2 weeks? Were any of the things that you tried sort of helpful for you? Did you see any benefit in them? It's still very early days for a lot of the strategies. They often take a bit of practice and time to sort of bed in, so we wouldn't be expecting sort of stark changes. But is there anything that you did find particularly helpful that would be helpful for us to know? Okay, so knowing I'm not alone, I think Slido does that really well. Sort of being able to have lots of parents share their views all at once and being able to see, really see there's a community around you that are going through a similar thing. So learning about reassurance, didn't realize how much I was doing it. So yeah, so noticing all the times we fall into that direct reassurance, but also the indirect reassurance. So taking small steps, talking about anxiety and thinking about ways to reduce avoidance, that's fantastic. And similar to the comment above, starting to talk about that avoidance and noticing it a bit more. And also sort of just knowing a bit more about anxiety as well, having the tools and confidence. Fantastic. So we've got one more person typing, so I'll wait for them to finish before I move on. And it's just really helpful to see sort of what everyone has found useful. It helps us to know what parts of our content is sort of resonating with you, and what parts might need a little bit of tweaking maybe. So thinking about the support network, feeling less alone, that's fantastic. That's what we want to try and achieve. And the aims were to give you the strategies, but also to give you the confidence and to remind or let everyone know that you're not going through this on your own. Okay, anxiety is a really common difficulty that young people face, and parents are the ones that are often closest to that situation. Okay, so on the flip side, what did you find challenging or more tricky? And this could be something we mentioned in the workshop that perhaps didn't quite sit okay, or perhaps something you tried and it didn't quite work out the way you thought it might. So what did you find was a bit challenging or a bit tricky? I'll just give you a moment to type. Okay, so my child still gets angry, and we spoke a bit last time about how anxiety can come through as frustration and anger, and I suppose we've got to be a bit grounded and think, well, actually these strategies won't change things overnight. They'll take a bit of time, and so we have to try and sort of work our way through this slowly, and hopefully that anger will start to reduce as that anxiety reduces as well. So I wanted everything to change at once. So yes, essentially what I've just been saying, you wanted everything to change at once. Daughter is still anxious and I can't change this overnight. And I think that's a really tricky thing when we think about mental health and sort of difficulties with emotions, is that as parents, we want to take these difficult feelings away. We want the change to happen overnight because we don't like seeing our children going through distress. But the fact is that actually it takes time. Just like any change, it takes time for it to bed in. I tried to discuss aspects of my son, but he was not very interested. So yeah, so trying to find the right time and the right way of pitching it to a young person is something that is going to be a bit trial and error. It's not a one size fits all. And this is why we think about trying to build parents for adolescents more as coaches rather than managers. So with younger children, we can have parents take more of a manager role of really giving that direction. But with adolescents, when they're striving for that independence, we find that more of a coaching role is helpful. So it might be a case that your son just might not be that engaged with what you were bringing, or with that particular strategy, trying something else or trying it in a different way can be helpful as well. And like I said, trial and error, it takes a bit of time. Finding the time can be difficult as well. All of our lives are very busy, and that's something that we just need to try and make some space for where we can. And I think, again, just having a realistic sort of aspiration about how that's going to work can be helpful as well. My son doesn't like self-assurance, which is fair enough. It can be quite an uncomfortable feeling and way of doing things to start with. So I think it's about trying to build that up with him and doing that as a joint process, sort of collaboratively, so he starts to learn how to do that, but also modeling that yourself. So if you start to feel anxious about something and it's appropriate for your child to know that, sort of showing that you can engage in that self-assurance yourself. And it's so hard to stop reassuring. I've said it's going to be fine before I know it. And it's a bit of a knee-jerk reaction at times. It's a really quick way of trying to alleviate that distress. And we really have to try and be mindful of it. But it just takes time, and I think you're all probably doing fantastically. So thank you for sharing that with us. It's really helpful for us to bear that in mind as we move forward. And when we repeat these webinars again, it's helpful for us to know what some parents might be finding a bit more tricky. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Gemma, who's going to talk us through a little bit about managing worry.
Thanks, Alice. So to start off with this week, this session, we just want to think about worry, because it's something that's so common when our young people are anxious. When any of us are anxious, we experience a lot of worry. And sometimes worry can be really good. It can be really helpful, because if we're worried about something, sometimes that's the thing that kind of prompts us that actually we need to do something about it. It usually shows that we care about something, or that something's about to happen or might happen that we want to kind of put some thought into. Usually we kind of try to make worry a bit simpler to understand. We think about more difficult, more challenging worries kind of coming in two types. So you've got what we call the worry tree on the slide. And we kind of split worry into, either real world kind of solvable practical worries. So usually a situation that's kind of in our control. So it might be for your young person, they've got their GCSEs coming up and they're worried about them, but there are practical things they can do to kind of reduce that worry. Like they can get a revision timetable, or talk to their teachers, or do some extra studying, or make sure they get their coursework done on time, things like that. That's a kind of practical solvable worry, because we're worried about it, but we can do something about it to kind of help reduce that worry. And the other kind of worry that's often really challenging is the hypothetical worries. And sometimes these can be things that seem quite unrealistic, things that aren't likely to happen. They're often future worries. So worrying about something that might happen in the future, or it might not happen. They're usually really unpredictable. And I kind of always look out for this sort of what if questions, what if this happens? What if that happens? Because our brain, when we're anxious, is just so good at coming up with multiple kind of scenarios. And we talked about the thinking traps last time. So that kind of catastrophizing, spiraling worries that come up with all these horrible solutions, scenarios that kind of could happen, but probably never will happen. And they're really hard to sort of find solutions for because of that reason. So sometimes it's helpful to hold those two distinctions in mind, the kind of hypothetical worries and the solvable worries. And I think it's really important to say that the boundary between what's a hypothetical worry for some people and what's a real kind of solvable worry changes from person to person, because we've all got different skills, we've all got different abilities, and we've all got different experiences in our lives that we're dealing with. I think what it's so important to say is that the emotion that we feel is the same. So whether it's a kind of hypothetical worry or a solvable worry, we're probably still going to experience that same fight flight kind of response, that rush of maybe adrenaline or anxiety. We might get the same physical symptoms. We might have the same emotional response. We're still going to be feeling frightened or scared, anxious. So, and that's all part of the kind of experience of worry, is that we still get all these feelings, even if we've got a practical worry we can solve, or a hypothetical worry that might never happen. So that's just to kind of help you kind of make that distinction there. I think we're going to move on now and just focus on hypothetical worries to start with. And as I said, these are worries which can't be problem solved. And they're usually, like I said, identified by being about a sort of future event, something that might happen or it might not happen. And often it's the uncertainty about whether or not this worry will happen or not that makes it so stressful and scary for adolescents. And I think, for that reason, it's often really challenging for parents because it's so hard to provide an answer or a reassurance or a solution to something that just might never ever happen. And I think it's really important to think about where adolescents are in their lives. For a lot of times they're coming up with their first experiences of things, or if they're maybe at the end of high school, going to college or sixth form, or thinking about life kind of after school. There are so many future things that kind of could or couldn't happen. Often it's a time where those kind of hypothetical worries can really feel very strong and very difficult. So I think it's just important to kind of distinguish those hypothetical kind of worries, that sometimes the difficulty, especially as a parent, is there's not something we can actually do to solve them or to resolve them. And that's where they can feel quite difficult. So I just want to move to the slider really to get you to start thinking about, are there any kind of hypothetical worries that you or your adolescent have experienced? Just so we can start to think about how these worries might come up, or where you might hear them, what they might sound like. I think it's really important to remember that, if it's hypothetical or a solvable worry, it often depends on the context of your child, whether or not it's something that they can do anything about. It really varies from person to person and the circumstances. So if you are seeing something come up and you think, oh, I think that's a solvable worry, that doesn't mean you're right or wrong. It's kind of dependent on the person. And I think, it's really important to think about, how those different types of worries still hold the same feeling. So we've got some hypothetical worries that have come in. Someone saying, what if something bad happens? I think that's brilliant. How do you answer what if something bad happens as a parent? How frightening is that? Thinking something bad might happen and I don't know what it is. I don't know when it's going to happen. So that's and often people don't know what they're worried about, but they just know they're worried something bad will happen. So you might hear that a lot as parents. Someone else saying they're worried their friends will laugh, or that the teacher will shout. And I think often, these what if worries are about the unpredictable nature of other people's behavior, what other people kind of might do. So that's a really good example. What if mum dies when I go to school? It's really common for people to worry about things happening to their parents or their loved ones, especially in the context of kind of all the kind of things we see in the news. People become very aware of kind of frightening situations, and they can become really fearful. Or if parents are in ill health or have experienced ill health in the past, teens might hold on to that and might worry, do I need to be around to make sure my mum or my dad or whoever looks after me is okay? And it might not be logical to you as a parent, but that might be what they're kind of worrying about. Got some other ones. What if I have a test and I fail? Really good example of one that could be hypothetical or solvable, because actually, you could do something about that, but maybe you can't. Maybe you really struggle with that topic. Maybe it's not your natural kind of gift. And so maybe that could be hypothetical, or it could be solvable. Worrying about getting picked on. Again, the unpredictable kind of behavior of other people. Worrying about being away from me, I guess that means parents. So that kind of separation, the unknown of what might happen. Worrying they won't cope. I think that's a really good example. Again, like if you don't know what you're worrying about having to face, you don't know if you're going to cope with it or not. So suddenly these worries start to kind of really cycle. Worrying about people will judge them or bully them. Children can be horrible to one another. Yeah, I think it's definitely important to acknowledge that sometimes, we want to protect our young people from having any kind of those difficult experiences, but sometimes one cruel comment or nasty word can really, create a sense of worry about what might happen again in the future. And it's something that we just can't account for. We don't know what people are going to be like when we kind of bump into them, but that worry can be really strong for some people. And worrying about not having friends in the new school. I think that's another really good example of it's a bit solvable, because he could do some, there are some things to maybe put yourself out there, but it's also really hypothetical because you just don't know there's so many variables that could affect that, you know, who's in the class or how friendly they are. So really good examples there. I think I want to move on to think about, you know, what makes it difficult for you as a parent to help your adolescent cope when they're worried. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the difficult kind of feelings that someone else being worried can kind of bring up for us, and bring up for them. Like, you know, often with hypothetical worries, people can be really embarrassed. They might feel like their worries are really silly because they're just not going to happen. They can feel a sense of shame, but they're still really affected by the worry. And, you know, there are no silly worries, really. Worries vary with all of us. It's just that we all need a different kind of approach. Someone's saying that what makes it really hard is the young person wants certainty, and they can't give that. And, you know, I really feel for this parent. I think they've really hit on something important, because we do also as parents just want to say, you know, I guess it goes back to that reassurance thing. It's going to be fine. Everything's going to be okay. But actually, sometimes we just don't know. And having to sit with the worry and see what happens is the really hard part. And someone else saying they won't talk to me. Yeah. And I think that's really common. Sometimes we're embarrassed by our worries, or we're really frightened. If I say this worry out loud, it kind of makes it real, and I'm not sure I can solve it. So what do I do with that? I just hold on to it. And yeah, that can be really difficult as a parent, because you want to find out, you know, what's going on. Can I help? There's someone saying that there's nothing that they can say to make it go away. Their worries sometimes make me worry about the same things. And I think that's a really, really important point, that, you know, sometimes there isn't something you can do about a worry. Sometimes these worries teenagers are coming up with are kind of life questions. You know, am I going to get a good job? Is everything going to be all right in the future? Is someone I love going to be hurt or get sick? We all worry about these things, and that's really normal. So sometimes when you've got, you know, your teenager kind of coming up to you with these worries, and there's nothing you can say to kind of appease that, it can be really difficult as parents. And of course, it's natural, we hold the same worries too. So I think that's really really, really helpful. I think it's really important to say that there's, you know, worries are really difficult. They're often moving goalposts. Sometimes you feel like you just get rid of one and another one comes up. So the fact that worries are bringing up all these feelings for people is completely normal, and what any of us would expect hearing these worrying things. I think, you know, often for me, what I think about when I'm trying to distinguish in my head between, is it kind of a hypothetical or a solvable worry, is, you know, what can I do something about it? And that's kind of what we'll come back to as we think about the different kinds of worries. I think because we've talked about how difficult it is, you know, the difficult feelings that worries can kind of bring up for all of us, for our teens and our parents, really want to give you guys some kind of practical tips of ways you can just cope in the moment, especially if you're dealing with a hypothetical worry and there's nothing you can do to kind of solve it or get rid of it, or it's just a worry that's arrived in your day, and now what do you do? So I want to think about how we can kind of help you cope in the moment. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that, you know, maybe you can't solve it. You probably can't if it's a hypothetical worry. That's kind of the whole point. But what you can do is you can come alongside your young person. You can share in the experience of the emotion with them. And you can say, I'm really, you know, I really see how upset you are. I see that you're really worried. And you can kind of help them sit with that emotion, and also normalize that for them and say, you know, there's nothing wrong with how you're feeling. This is a completely normal response to a frightening worry. You know, I felt the same, or I would feel the same, and just kind of sit with that feeling. Just letting them know that, you know, our emotions, when we feel strongly about something, they're telling us something about how we feel and about what's going on in our lives. And so emotions are really important to understanding our own human experiences. They're kind of our barometer of how do we feel about something. And that's really important, not to kind of try and suppress that. We can sit with that. It might not be very comfortable, it might not be very nice, but we're safe to kind of explore that together. And I think part of that as well is thinking about what helps you as a parent calm your emotional response as well in that moment, so you can sit with that feeling. I think sometimes it's just being physically close, just being kind of proximate, just staying with them when they're distressed, talking about what helps them. Do they want a hug? Do they want you to sit together? Do they want you to kind of talk about it? Sometimes people don't want to talk in the moment. And so just kind of establishing that. I think it's also just so important to let your young person know that like the distress is going to pass. It won't be at this peak forever. And think about some of the activities that might help them to cope until the feeling of being really worried does pass. I think on the slide we've got some ideas. So things like maybe they need to kind of do some grounding, just kind of really focus on where they are, what's in the room, maybe use their senses to kind of help them calm down from the worry that they're thinking about in their head and kind of come back into their bodies in the moment. Maybe they need to kind of keep a journal, write these worries down and come back to them and just see that actually I had that worry and I'm not worried about it anymore. Maybe, you know, they need to kind of unplug from social media, switch off and just kind of, you know, get rid of some of those distractions. Or maybe they need to go out the house, kind of change the scenery, go for a walk, do something else. So there's lots of different activities that could be helpful, but can really help you to maybe have some ideas of things you might suggest to your young person. And I think the final thing I just kind of end on before kind of handing back to Ellis is thinking about picking your moment. You know, if they're really, really distressed with a worry, maybe the only thing you can do in that moment is just to sit with them. Just sit with the feeling, acknowledge it and stay with them. And then the other things, you know, talking about the worry, writing in the journal, they might come later. But sometimes parents feel like they're doing that. There's nothing they can do, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe just being there is enough in that moment. And talking to your young person, asking them, how do you want me to respond? What do you need from me in that moment? So when they're not feeling kind of really worried, you can have that conversation to plan for maybe when they are and what they might like you to do. So just a few ideas there about how to kind of cope in the moment with worries. And I'm going to hand over to Ellis now to kind of think about some of those uncomfortable feelings.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Gemma. So yeah, like Gemma was saying, our worries tend to come up and they do tend to pass on their own, but while they're with us, they might sort of get bigger, they might get a bit smaller, might move around our heads a bit. And as well as trying to find ways to cope, I suppose it's also helpful to try and think of ways in which we can live with these uncomfortable feelings. So even though things like anxiety, sadness, anger, they're all uncomfortable feelings and they're not particularly pleasant to experience, they are all part of being a human and part of that human experience. We can't be happy all the time. That's just not feasible. And if we were happy all the time, then we perhaps wouldn't experience that happiness in the same way. We wouldn't have anything to compare it to. So experiencing things like worry and sadness, while they can be uncomfortable and not particularly pleasant, they're all a valuable part of that human experience. So sometimes we have to try and learn ways that we can live with those uncomfortable feelings, but sort of with the mindset that actually they will go and they will pass on their own over time. So if we look at the picture on the left, we sort of see a monster playing tug of war with a person. And we can imagine that the person is ourselves or our young person. And they're playing tug of war over a ravine, but no one's falling in. We're trying to pull as hard as we can to pull the anxiety, to pull that monster away and to get rid of him. But he just won't budge. He's stuck firmly where he is. And this is really how we can think about our anxieties. We can battle with it. We can try and push them down, push them away. We can focus on thinking. We can focus on not thinking about them as much as possible. But what happens is the monster stays. The anxiety is firmly stuck to the floor. And we haven't made any progress in getting rid of it. But what we have done is made ourselves really tired with feeling some of that exhaustion. And we're missing out on being able to do things that we might want to do otherwise. So there's an analogy, if we think about this tug of war, where we can sometimes say, well, let's just try dropping the rope. Rather than having that battle with our anxiety and with our worry, instead, let's drop the rope and try and focus our attention and our energy onto things that we enjoy doing, you know, things that might match up with our values, like we spoke about in part one. And sort of by doing that, we can start to live a bit more of a fulfilling life and get a bit more out of our lives than spending a lot of energy in battling with that anxiety. Now, I'm not saying to go away and just tell your young person to get on with it. It's just anxiety. That's let's move on and do something fun. It needs to be communicated in a sensitive way, and sometimes that story is a nice way of communicating it. There's also some really amazing videos on YouTube that explain it really nicely that you might want to show your young person, that we can send out as part of our follow-up email. But if you sort of search tug of war of a monster onto YouTube, that it should come up with things like this. So we're trying to think about ways that we can live with these uncomfortable feelings until they pass on their own. Another analogy that we can think of is considering our emotions as being like passengers on a bus. So if you imagine that you're the bus driver and you're driving through the city, every now and then people will get on, you'll go a few stops down the road and people will get off again. And we can think of these passengers as our emotions. So we might stop at our first stop and anxiety gets on, and we go 5 stops down the road and eventually they get off. They've done their traveling, they've reached their destination, and then they pass. And it's the same for all of our emotions. We're not, like I said, we're not happy 100% of the time, but we're also not anxious 100% of the time. We'll have moments of sort of respite, I suppose, that we don't feel as anxious as we have done. And it's about trying to find those moments where those emotions pass and to sort of acknowledge that, yeah, these emotions do sort of come in and out on their own. They do pass and they fade away. So sort of that can be quite containing for young people to know that even though it's really uncomfortable what they're feeling at the moment, that this isn't going to be forever. And like Gemma was saying, coming alongside, sitting with your young person to let them know that they're safe in feeling those emotions. Okay, so we've spoken a bit about those hypothetical worries, sort of moving down the right-hand side of that worry tree where we can't do anything about it. But what about the worries where we can do something about it, the solvable worries? So we're going to think a little bit about the practical steps that we can take with solvable worries to help reduce that anxiety in a really logical and structured way. Before we do that, let's have a little bit of a think together about some solvable worries that you or your adolescent might have experienced. So for me, I know that I can get solvable worries about doing things for work. Maybe I have a project that feels a bit much, and I can take steps to try and reduce that anxiety by maybe speaking with the people in my team or planning it out so it doesn't feel so overwhelming. And exams is a really good one. So like Gemma said earlier, exams are things that we can sort of take some steps around. Generally speaking, we can speak to our teachers to try and get some support. We can plan out some revision. We can do a revision timetable so it doesn't feel so overwhelming. And again, like Gemma said, some of these solvable worries for some people might be hypothetical worries for other people. It all depends on the context, which is absolutely okay. So homework not being right. So how can we make that solvable? So, speaking to the teacher or getting some support from a parent, maybe after you've done it to check it through, or checking the answers yourself in a textbook, things like that. Coping with a family party or going out. So we can start to solve that worry maybe by taking small steps and building up to those situations that we find quite anxious. And that sort of graded exposure is something that Gemma's going to talk about a little bit later. Friendship breakdowns, yeah. So we can take steps like writing letters or trying to plan out what we might say to our friend to try and repair that relationship. Having to do speeches in class, so that preparation or doing some of that graded build up, taking small steps to expose ourselves to what that situation might be like. And then worries about friends, again, we can try and take some steps towards that, similar with exam worries, and doing something new. So you'll see how we can start to use something called problem solving to create sort of logical steps to manage some of these worries in a logical way. Okay, thank you very much for all of your answers. Before I sort of delve into problem solving, it's worth bearing in mind and thinking back to the brain house, where if our young person has flipped their lid and they can't access that upstairs part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, where all that logical thinking is, problem solving is going to be really difficult. It's really hard to think logically when We're being driven by our emotions through a need to keep safe. So we might want to do some of the regulation exercises, the coping in the moment, before we start doing the problem solving, just so that we're in a space in order to engage in it properly. So the first step of problem solving is to identify the problem. We can't solve a problem if we don't know what it is. So just really briefly, in a sentence or two, just try to describe what the actual problem is. And when we first start doing problem solving, it's probably something you'll need to do in collaboration with your young person, just to support them through the process. They might not be able to just go through it on their own straight from the off, and that's okay. It's a skill that we're trying to build up with them over time, just like self-assurance. We're trying to help them develop the skills so that they can use it independently in the future. So we think about the problem and we note that down. Then we try and think of possible choices that we can make, possible solutions to the problem. And it's great if it's young person led. So if your young person can think of the solutions themselves, and maybe parents can offer a few different perspectives if they haven't thought of one. But it's really worth bearing in mind that the possible solutions or choices can be anything. We really want sort of any choices to come up if the young person mentions them, even if we as parents don't think that they're particularly suitable, because we're going to go on to thinking about the pros and cons, and it's all part of the process. So for instance, I've done this with young people before where they might be worried about going to a particular lesson. And one of the choices that they said was, well, I just won't go to school. And while I know that's probably not the best way of managing that anxiety, it still went on this list so that we could think about that further and think about why it might be helpful, but also why it might be unhelpful. So we want to think of lots of different choices from lots of different perspectives. Parents can often fall into a trap of trying to emphasize the choice that they think is the right one. And it's okay to offer that choice as a perspective, but remember, we're trying to support the young person into being able to do this process on their own. So they need to be able to come up with solutions and choices as well. So once we've got a list, and I'd suggest not making it too long, but there's 3 on this page, maybe 4, 5, 6 solutions might be helpful. And then we're going to try and think about the pros and cons for each one. So break down each choice, what's going to be helpful about it, how's it going to help solve the problem, and what might get in the way, and what might the repercussions be from doing it. So for example, avoiding school because you don't want to go to a particular lesson, well, the pro would be that you don't have to go to the lesson, so that anxiety is going to go down straight away. But the cons would be, you're avoiding, so we know that's going to make it more difficult in the long term. But also, you're not going to go to school, and you'll probably get in trouble for that, which is going to make even more problems. So we want to try and break down the pros and cons as much as we can. And again, you might have perspectives that your young person doesn't have, so it can be helpful to share those perspectives as well. And this is where we start to break down some of those unhelpful solutions that might be on the table to help the young person to see why they're not particularly useful in that moment. Then we move on to picking a solution based on the pros and cons. So we pick one of the choices, and ideally this is, again, young person led. We want the young person to decide the solutions so they take ownership. As human beings, we often don't like being done to, we like being done with, essentially. So if you say, right, this is your solution, go away and do it, the motivation probably isn't going to be there as much. Whereas if your young person says, okay, I'm going to try this one, they're already more motivated to give it a go, which is what we want them to be. So encourage a young person to find a solution based on the pros and cons that they've just thought about. Then make an action plan. So the steps of how you're going to put that into play, and including sort of what you're going to do, where you're going to do it, when you're going to give it a go, and who you're going to do it with if other people are going to be around. Then after they've done and put into place that action plan, when they've given it a go, perhaps the most important part of this whole process is the review. So we need to come back, speak with our young person and say, how did it go? What went well? What didn't go well? What were the potential barriers that we need to think about? If the problem wasn't solved, do we need to go back and look at the possible solutions again and try another one? We might find that actually the solutions don't work, and it might be an unsolvable worry that we've just realized now that we can't do too much about it. So let's move to the other side of the tree. It's problem solving is really a bit of a trial and error situation. we don't know necessarily what's going to be the best solution right from the off. And this is why that review process is so important. It helps to consolidate the skills that your young person is learning, and also helps them to start thinking about some of the things that might get in the way of their solutions in the future. So again, it's all about the process. Getting to the end result is important, but having the young person go through the process is helping them to build the skills so that they can do it independently in the future, which is where we want them to try and get to. So that's how we do problem solving, and you'll get an example of sort of template for problem solving in the follow-up email if you consented to that when you signed up. And we're going to leave the worry tree there for now. So just moving on to something a little bit different, I wonder if you can let me know how you manage worry within your family. And please sort of feel free to be as open and honest as you want. I'm trying to, I suppose, think about some of the helpful but also unhelpful ways that we might try and manage worry within our family unit. Because we know that it's not just our young people that get worried. We all get worried from time and again. And we know that worry from one person in the family can often lead to sort of a little bit of difficulty within the rest of the family. You know, it can have an impact on everyone. So one thing that someone suggested is to try to talk about it, but they don't listen. And that's actually what someone else has said. They don't like to talk about it and they brush it away. And I wonder if that's the young person that's worried, or if that's sort of the family unit in general, which is be quite interesting to know. So my partner will say it's silly and not to worry, which I don't think is helpful. And it can be really challenging when we're trying to try something a little bit different to help our young people with some of these emotional difficulties they might have, sort of some of these uncomfortable feelings. And it's unhelpful sometimes if, you know, the people that are supposed to be in our support network and backup team aren't quite on the same page. So maybe, you know, trying to communicate with your partner about why it might be helpful can be useful at times. You found out to try and joke about worries to make them less scary. Yeah, humor is a really, really effective tool that we try to use to manage worry, but also sadness, sort of any difficult emotion. Humor can often break through quite nicely. Maybe we talk about it too much. It draws more attention to it now that I think about it. Yeah, so I think we can sort of fall on different ends of the spectrum of not talking about worry at all, and also sometimes talking about it too much. And it's useful to sort of be aware of what we're doing, of how we're doing and what we're doing there. So my partner doesn't like talking about it. And again, adults within our family networks are just like our young people. Everyone has sort of a different approach to this sort of stuff, to being comfortable about talking about their emotions and not being comfortable. And I suppose it can be helpful to try and think about why it's important to talk about this sort of stuff, and to try and do that in a way that feels safe for the other people as well within the family unit. We don't really manage worry. We usually distract ourselves. And I mean, some people might argue that distraction can be a way of managing worry. It can be a helpful way of doing things that are important to us, but like dropping the rope, we'll try and do things that are meaningful rather than spend all that energy focusing on the worry. So I would say that that can be a way that you are managing, which is good. Okay, so thank you for sharing those with me. I guess I'm just wondering as well, whether you talk to your adolescent about your own worries. So we've thought a little bit about how you manage worry in your family. I suppose I'm thinking as a parent, when we get worried, do you talk to your young person about that at all? Or do you sort of, I suppose, put a brave face on it? It's probably a fair way of thinking about it. So I'll just give you a moment to respond to this. Okay, so we've sort of got the majority of people saying no, I don't talk to my young person about my own worries, and we've got some people that say yes. Okay, that's a bit more of a 50-50 split going towards now. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit before I pass over to Gemma about leading by example. So I think a lot of parents can be a bit worried about being seen as vulnerable, which is understandable. You know, we want to be a strong figure for our children to show them that, you know, we're always going to be there and available, and If we show them our own worries, that can lead to concerns that, oh, maybe they'll think I'm not available for them because I've got my own stuff going on. But actually, parents can really help to show adolescents how to cope with worry, and they can help to show that worry is normal. If our young people never see us worry, when they experience it themselves, that can feel a little bit scary and a little bit alien, I suppose. Whereas if our parent has shown us a little bit about what worry looks like and that we all experience worry, it starts to normalize that a bit more. It starts to make them feel that actually this is just part of life, like that's going to be with me throughout my adolescence, but also throughout adulthood. Worries are going to pop up now and again. That's part of being human. And then if we start to show those worries, we can start to show how we cope with those worries. We can show some of the helpful strategies we use when we're anxious. And then our young people might start taking those on board, sort of absorbing that by osmosis almost, sort of taking that on like the picture shows, sort of almost if our brains are connected. One thing that was mentioned in the slide previously about talking about our worries too much is just something to be mindful of as well. So there needs to be a balance when we think about leading by example, where we sort of share or try to share, if it feels okay with you, age appropriate worries, providing that we're modeling how to manage them helpfully. It can be quite unhelpful, I suppose, to talk about worries that aren't age appropriate for a young person. So like financial worries or anything that might make a young person feel unsafe. So we have to sort of, it's quite a fine line to tread, but it can be really helpful to show some of that vulnerability, I suppose, in yourself and how you manage that as well. But yeah, just be mindful about maintaining a bit of a boundary of what you share, so we're not oversharing and we're trying to keep it balanced. So that's just something to consider moving forward. Okay, so Gemma's going to talk us through the next part of the webinar.
Okay, thanks, Alice. So I just want to kind of start by just drawing on what I'm sure is a really broad range of experiences that you've all got as parents. So I just want you to have a little think about, maybe some things that you've missed out on in the past because of feeling anxious. Maybe it's something you wanted to do, but you didn't feel able to because you were a bit worried about it. But I just want to kind of get a flavor of that. And then I'll kind of show you where we're going with this idea. I think it's really normal to say we've all missed out on things because of feeling anxious or worried about it. I know I definitely have. So I just want to get a flavor of some of those things. Having fun, yeah, definitely. Sometimes just doing something for fun or something you really want to do, like maybe going out with friends or something like that, but you're a bit worried. Taking on opportunities at work, yeah, like maybe you feel like, oh, I could do that, I could put myself forward for it, but you're a bit worried that will it work out or not? So maybe you held yourself back, but actually you would have been brilliant at this new opportunity. Going to a youth club, so someone kind of thinking back to when they were younger, something they wanted to do, and maybe they didn't feel able to. Someone saying they don't think they've really missed out on things because they were told by their parents, kind of just get on with it, and that's what they tell their daughter. So kind of pushing yourself forward in a way, like pushing yourself kind of through situations because you to kind of face them. And someone saying they missed out on being in the school play. And often it's when we look back and we think about those kind of memories of things like, what did I do? What didn't I do? Why was that? So yeah, maybe looking back at the school play. I think this is a brilliant one that's so relevant to, the teenagers now, like wearing clothes I like for fear of being judged, resisting instead of thinking I have to just be resting, instead of thinking I have to be doing something. So yeah, there's some really good ideas there. I think definitely things where we feel maybe we're going to be like judged by other people as well. We can really hold ourselves back, maybe something we want to do, but we're worried what other people might think. I think a really good example of that is like dancing. Often when you're really young as a child, you really like dancing, going to parties, you might dance around, but get a lot more self-conscious kind of as you get older. So it's a really good example. I guess I want to move on now to think about what are the strategies that you used to kind of help you overcome your anxiety. And somebody already said that they were told, to just kind of get on with it. And so that's their kind of approach. But I want to think about your experiences and what's helped you overcome your anxiety in the past. Because there'll probably be some really rich ideas here that, naturally you've got these ideas that you can share with your young people. So someone saying they kind of talk to a friend and yeah, just share the worry. That helps. If you're feeling anxious, telling someone saying just kind of jumping in the deep end, just making yourself just go through it, just do it, face the fear, don't think about it too much, just kind of go for it. Someone taking a bit of a different approach, maybe breaking it down into smaller steps, trying to gradually ease your way in. Talking to a friend, reward or motivation, I think that's another really good one. Sometimes thinking about, how can I kind of incentivize myself to do this thing that I really don't want to do, but I probably need to do. That's a really good one. So we've got a real mix and a range of kind of responses. And I think that's really important to say, because not everything is going to work for all people. Just like you as a group of adults have all got different ways of overcoming and dealing with your anxiety, so will your young people. I think Ella said earlier, it's not a kind of one size fits all. But naturally as a group, you've shown you've got loads of already good ways of kind of managing anxiety and things that could kind of help. I think jumping in and kind of facing the fear head on, it can be really helpful for some people because it kind of gets rid of that uncertain weight of like what's going to happen. But it can sometimes be overwhelming for people, and sometimes they can then just feel so overwhelmed by their anxiety that they then can become even a bit more avoidant because it makes them feel so uncomfortable. So I want to kind of move on and think about something that some other people have said, which is about how do you break fears down into some kind of smaller steps to kind of make them feel more manageable. And I've put on the screen what we call like the anxiety curve. And it just links back to something we talked about last time, which is that, naturally our instinct, we want to just avoid things that make us feel anxious. So that, the red line, you fear a situation. If you were to avoid it, your anxiety would just kind of come straight down. But then the next time it happened, it would go straight up again and straight down. So if you face your fears, if you break them down into steps, maybe the first time your anxiety is really high, the first time you don't avoid it, and then it goes down. But then if you look at the green line, the second time you face something that makes you feel anxious, you actually feel less anxious to start with, and your anxiety comes down a bit quicker. And the same with the third line, the blue line. The third time you put yourself in an anxious situation, you get even less anxious, and you're anxious for less time, and you feel better about it sooner. So I guess the message is that by being exposed to our fears over time, it teaches us that we can cope, often a lot more than we ever thought we could, with a kind of feared situation. And we learn that our anxiety reduces over time. And also we get more experience and develop more trust in ourselves and our coping skills. And it just links back to what we've already said, which is that, avoidance, it provides that kind of short-term relief, but in the long term, it's gradually facing our fears that teaches us that we can cope and we can kind of develop those coping skills. And we've talked a bit, about the upstairs, downstairs brain. And I think it's just acknowledging that if we use those kind of upstairs thinking skills, when our downstairs is saying like hitting the panic button, we're flipping our lid, we want to run away, if we can re-engage those kind of thinking skills, we can use those to kind of calm the downstairs brain and stay in the situation we're afraid of long enough to kind of learn, actually, we can cope with this, we can manage this. So I'm going to show you how to kind of maybe an exercise you can do with your young person to just kind of break whatever it is that they might be worried about into kind of smaller steps. And often I kind of use the visual image of like a ladder with people because it kind of makes sense. You start at the bottom and work your way up, but you could do this in so many different creative ways. It could be whatever kind of makes sense or clicks for your young person, but a ladder is kind of universal. So I'll just explain it in this way. I think the idea is, you sit down and it really is a conversation and a collaboration with your young person, because I think the thing that you really want them to work on might not be the place they want to start or the thing they want to work on. So first of all, it's really important that it's your young person that kind of sets the goal or the top step, which is, and the one at the top is the thing that they really want to do, the kind of bigger goal, but their anxiety means that they find it too hard to do. So here, the example is joining in a conversation with a large group of people. So you might imagine this person maybe wants to join in a conversation with a big group of friends, but they feel too anxious. So that's your kind of your top goal. And often what I get people to do is kind of rate, if 0 is like, I don't feel anxious at all, and 10 is like, oh, I feel so anxious, I couldn't even think about doing that right now. I'll kind of put that at the top. And that's where I would know my top and my bottom of the anxiety. And then you might want to start thinking about, okay, well, let's break that down. Like, what are some things, what's in the middle of, not talking to anyone at all and joining in a conversation with a large group of people? And then you can kind of work backwards or forwards with the steps that kind of make sense to your young person. So you might start off here with this example of like joining in a conversation with a couple of very close friends. So something, and you can see this person would rate that as a 1, something that maybe just makes them feel a tiny bit anxious, but not too much. And it's, that's completely okay to start with something that feels really manageable. I think often what I do with people is I get, post-it notes and kind of write the steps on it and move them around, because sometimes as a parent, what you think might make your young person feel really anxious, actually that might not make them feel worried at all, but something you wouldn't have thought of, actually that would be really significant for them. So it's really about having a conversation to think about, and using the ladder as a way to kind of break that worry down and to think about how it can be tackled. So we don't have to just kind of have this anxiety and just avoidance isn't our only option. How could we break it down? What would those steps be like? And you always want to make the order, what is most anxiety provoking for your young person. So it might not be what's logical to you, but it will kind of make sense to them of the way they want to tackle those steps. So I think we're going to move on now to just kind of have a couple of tips, because there are some things you can do to kind of make this easier. So I would say, definitely starting with the goal at the top and the first step at the bottom, just set your kind of parameter. And if you can, be really specific with the goal. What is it exactly that you want to be able to do, but because you're feeling really anxious at the moment, you're not able to do? So a goal of, kind of like, going to school is really, really broad. There's so many things involved in that. How could you make that more specific? What's the thing that you want to, or breaking down the steps, so you're kind of making that much more specific, because it's important your young person gets a sense of achievement, and to do that they're going to need to know what is it that they need to do at each step to kind of feel that they've achieved that. I think it's also really important to say that it's completely normal to need to kind of repeat steps until your anxiety is reduced. And usually what I would say to someone is, if you're rating something as making you a kind of 4 out of 10 anxious, keep repeating that step until it makes you feel about a 1 or a 2, until your anxieties come down about half, because gradually these should be things that you can start to do without feeling anxious at all. Like we saw with the curve, the anxiety comes down the more times that we expose ourselves to doing something. So don't worry if you need to repeat steps. Don't worry if you need to stay on a step for a little while until, if that's really difficult for your young person, they might need to repeat that 3, 4, 5, 6 times, sometimes, just to really feel comfortable with a step. And that's all really valuable coping experiences. I think because of that, it's really important to, reflect back and kind of monitor how they're feeling as well. Did they say something was kind of going to be really easy, and then actually they've done the step before and that feels too hard? You can always kind of break that down or put in half steps if you need to. And definitely start with an easy win. The thought of facing something that you're really anxious about can be really frightening. So, your young person is going to need lots of kind of encouragement and praise for just even beginning to make the attempt. And if you can start with an easy win, that really helps build like motivation for the next kind of step. And you want to kind of get a bit of a momentum going. And like we said before, just be open to change. If the steps are too hard or they're too easy, it can easily be swapped or changed, because as you go through this process, you're going to be learning so much more about what makes your young person feel anxious, and also, how they are developing the skills to manage that. I think we've said before, it has to really come from the young person, and it's helping them develop their independence as well. It might feel quite strange to sit down and have this conversation, but you're really teaching them the skill, just like with the problem solving, you're kind of teaching them the structure, but they can go on and use this many, many times over whenever they have a problem that they feel anxious about, and they want to kind of have a strategy of how to solve it. And yeah, finally, I think, just thinking about what's motivating. Some of you said you use motivation and rewards. It can sometimes help if there's a particularly difficult step, or, what's the reward? What are you going to do to kind of treat yourself, to keep yourself going on this journey? It can be really helpful. And again, they should be kind of led by your young person, whatever's motivating to them. So I've given loads of information there, and I just want to kind of come back to you now and get you to think about, when do you think this might be useful for your young person? Maybe you're sat there right now and you've got a goal in your mind and you're thinking, yeah, the ladder could really help with this. And I just wonder if you could share some of those so you can help each other think together about when the ladder might be useful and what kind of goals you might want to work on. I think we've got some people writing in, so I'll just have a look here. Going to school, someone said, I'm worried the reward may be difficult to materialize. Wonder what you mean by that, difficult to kind of materialize. Maybe you mean as a parent you can see the kind of benefit of them going to school, but they might not feel that for a while, or they might only see it in hindsight. But I think going to school is a really good example. There's so many steps you could use to kind of break that down, and really target the specific parts that make them feel anxious. Someone saying to walk to the shop on their own, that's a brilliant one. I mean, there's again lots of natural steps you could put in, and I guess a natural reward could be they get to buy whatever it is they want to buy in the shop. Step by step to getting to a party, again, that's brilliant. There's so many ways you could break that down. Maybe meeting up with a friend first, or maybe just texting a friend first. And you could really be led by them. And what kind of a party is it? Do you start with something smaller and then work up to something bigger? And we know that going to parties is, really part of that teenage experience. So that's something we're going to look back on and enjoy. Feeling confident about talking in the class and being able to go to a sports club. I think those are brilliant. Those ones where you kind of need to work up to something, getting out of your comfort zone. But once you've learned that, it's really going to benefit you in life. And again, lots of steps to talking in class. You can kind of work with the teachers as well to kind of set that up. I think this is someone coming back on what they said earlier about going to school as a goal. They're less motivated about going to school than you are, and it might mean an expensive reward. Okay, I see what you're saying. You're raising a really brilliant point. Sometimes I think, with rewards, we think it has to be kind of financial, like an incentive. Sometimes people do respond to that. I mean, everybody probably likes to have a bit of spending money. But I guess as a parent, it's just about having that conversation about, what the reward is that you could offer, and not putting any rewards on the table that you couldn't deliver on. But also, I think sometimes the rewards are not what we think they are. And sometimes having a big reward actually is just too much pressure, and people feel like they're never going to achieve it. So what's the point? And it feels a bit demotivating. I think a really good example of that is I've heard sometimes people say, oh, if you do this, we'll go on a nice family holiday. And then you've got like the weight of the family holiday on your shoulders if you can't work through your anxiety. So I would maybe take an approach of thinking about smaller rewards that can apply to each step. So maybe it's like time with you, or maybe it's about, getting to do an activity together, and you take the rewards in a smaller, like step-by-step way. I think that can be more motivating actually, because then it's something you can achieve and have the reward to reinforce it as you go, rather than feeling like you need to have a really expensive and big reward at the end of it. Just got a couple of other things that have come in, so I'll just respond to those and then we'll move on. So someone saying going outside and seeing their friends again. I think that's a really good one. Yeah, lots of ways you could kind of build that up gradually. And maybe ways you could be creative with using kind of like virtual meeting up first and then moving to face, lots of ideas there. And attending school again. So yeah, these are all great ideas of when the ladder could be really useful. So hopefully we've given you some ideas there of ways you can kind of put the ladder into action, into practice. And I'm just aware of time, so we're going to wrap up now for the end of the session. So on the screen, we've got all the strategies that we've kind of been talking about, and I just want to get you to reflect on what do you think you're going to take away from here, and what do you think you might try out using with your young person. So you can have a kind of plan in your mind of what you might want to go away and use with your young person. So we've got problem solving, coping in the moment, dropping the rope, the passengers on the bus, and modeling your own responses to worries. So lots of people saying the problem solving looks like it's going to be really helpful. And also, breaking down fears using the ladder. and modeling kind of response to worries. Okay, that's great. I think just to finish again, as we said last time, it would be great if we could have your feedback about whether or not you found the session helpful. All of our sessions are created based on what parents tell us they need and that they would find helpful. So, you know, if you could give some feedback, we'd really appreciate that. Brilliant. So just to kind of finish off, thinking about what happens next. So congratulations, you've come to the end of part 2, and we really hope you found the webinars helpful and that you've got some resources that you're able to kind of use, some strategies and ideas. We will send out some resources as well, just as last time. And we just want to point you to our YouTube channel. The Norfolk and Suffolk Foundation Trust YouTube channel has loads of videos and resources just like these ones. And it's a great free resource that you can use anytime you want. You can kind of watch videos back in your own time. If you have a period of time where you've tried out the strategies we've talked about, and do give yourself some time, because like we've said, it won't kind of happen overnight. But if you feel you need more support, then we'd always advise that you go to your GP and they can direct you to the most appropriate services in your area if you need them. So yeah, I think that's everything from us. Thanks for attending, and we really hope it's been helpful.
Yep, thank you very much. See you next time.